All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sam Renaut. I am here to host Sports Lawyers Association's Sports Shorts Episode 5. I'm joined by a good old friend of mine from law school, Dave Palanzo. Dave, you want to give us a brief, 20-second introduction on your title, your company, and what it is that you do?
Sorry. Sure. 20 seconds. That's a tight time frame. So I'm Senior Vice President, Legal and Business Affairs for the Women's Tennis Association. We are the professional tour for women's tennis. I think my role is probably self-explanatory. Cover all legal issues for the tour with a team of several attorneys and paralegal. So, yeah. Was that 20 seconds?
Well, welcome, and I apologize for the background noise here. Let's get started, and then I'll mute to save all your ears. COVID hit us March 12th of last year, effectively. Where were you? Where was women's tennis? What was going on at that point?
Well, me personally, my wife was about to give birth to our second child. She was born on March 14th. The 2 days after that, our office shut down. So the tour was out in Indian Wells, California, at one of our biggest tournaments, the BNP Paribas Open. We had started some play there. Like everyone else, caught completely off guard with, the effects of the pandemic, and had to scramble to make some decisions and eventually obviously stop play and shut things down like every other league.
Was that an independent decision? Who were you consulting with at that point? I mean, this was so soon and we didn't know what we were dealing with, but what other organizations did you see shutting down? Where did you get your advice from, if anybody? How'd that come to happen?
Yeah, so I mean, there were definitely conversations going on between certainly other tennis governing bodies. Indian Wells is a joint tournament between us and the ATP, so men and women players. So there were joint decisions made there. Obviously consulting with, again, ITF, International Tennis Federation, looking to see what other US leagues were doing, specifically because that tournament was in the US. But yeah, I think it just became pretty clear that we weren't going to be able to move forward as it did to everyone. There were just too many unknowns, too many risks at the time. And like everyone, we just had to take a pause and figure things out. And unfortunately, that pause ended up being longer than anybody wanted it to be.
Okay. All right, so we paused. We've shut down Indian Wells. What's next? I mean, you guys are now speaking to doctors. What's the next steps for WTA, and how do you start thinking about the next week's event and the next week after that?
Yeah, so that all happened pretty quickly. Like everyone, we want to keep the tour going. We want to keep the league going, and so we immediately began on working on plans as to how we could operate during a global pandemic. We did reach out for medical advice, worked with one of the biggest hospital groups in the US to start getting an understanding of what this disease was, what the virus was, and how we could effectively run a tournament in the environment. It's obviously it was not a quick process. We basically had those conversations and started the research and having internal conversations, all of that over a couple of months to try to get to a place where we felt at least comfortable enough to start poking holes in the plan that we had come up with. So I mean, for context, we shut down the beginning of March. Our first tournament back was towards the end of July. So the main focus there was really again creating a way to operate, and that was through what we call our COVID-19 operations manual. Very original name. But between our sports science and medicine team and myself and some others on the legal team, and obviously input from lots of staff, we wrote this manual. We kind of put it out there internally in June, and again just started poking holes in it, going through it with all the staff, going through it with our tournament members, our player members, getting feedback on, what this all means, and then finalized it, so to speak, in mid July, and yeah, went from there.
So how many, do you know, maybe you don't know the numbers offhand, but ballpark it, how many events are you guys responsible for each year, and in how many different countries are those events being held?
Yeah, so it does fluctuate a little bit year to year, but it's about 50 WTA tour tournaments, meaning our 1,500 and 250 level tournaments. And then anywhere from 10 to, we're working on 20 to 30 WTA 125 tournaments. And then obviously the Grand Slams are mixed in. They're part of our calendar, although they're not events that we control that are part of our tour. And so typically that's across around 30 countries that those events take place in a year.
And these are 30 countries, all who had different protocols for COVID, different lockdown priorities, and everything was different. So your manual had to address all of that, right? Like you've got to have carve outs for every single country you're dealing with.
Sort of, yeah. So that's just not possible, right? I mean, for us, just practically to understand all of the national and state level and then local regulations in each jurisdiction was just impossible. So we wrote our manual to be flexible, basically, because really we have to, giving discretion and authority to those governmental authorities when we got into their jurisdiction. So in 2020, I think we ended up actually having events in 6 different countries. But the typical process there would be working with the local tournament owner or promoter. We would present our manual to the local government, to the federal or national level government, and they would review it and basically tell us if we were authorized to play, and they would give us feedback. There'd be certain things where they would say, we don't like the way you're doing this, so you'll need to do that. Good example of that is quarantine protocols. We have in our manual that basically, depending on the player and the situation, it's possible for the player to leave her hotel room before her test results come back, so she can at least get some practice in when she arrives before the tournament starts. Some jurisdictions just were not comfortable with that. They said everyone has to quarantine for until they receive a negative test result, and that's otherwise, we can't operate.
So as we think about like what's going into this manual, you've got to kind of separate it out into buckets. Like there are certain priorities that you all have to deal with that WTA is responsible from a governance perspective. So let's talk through that. I mean, the first thing when we were prepping was going through, just in the first place, getting people to tournaments at all. So what's the approach there? How are we navigating that issue?
Yeah, I think, maybe the first thing to think about is that we realized early on, because of our structure, that we could not create a bubble like some of the other leagues decided to do. As much as it would have been, probably easier in some ways, probably more difficult than others. It's just, we have too many people in different locations, and our obviously our events in different locations. There were very early conversations about, could we have a string of events in one location and bring everybody in? And it just wasn't feasible. So getting the people to the tournaments was a process, because you're dealing with immigration issues, with border shutdowns, and again, we have athletes, I think, in close to 100 different countries, and so moving them into the countries where we had tournaments was, again, a lot of coordination with local and national governments, making sure that we got the authorization for, especially if there were kind of restrictions on movement, that we could get our athletes and their support team, their coaches, their trainers, their people taking care of their children, especially for our mothers on tour, trying to make sure that we could get the clearance for them to come in was, as you can imagine, a lengthy process.
So the next step then, I mean, that's a a burdensome activity, I guess, in and of itself. But then once you get people in, you've got to make sure everybody's safe. So what is it? What's the process for testing and screening and making sure that you said you couldn't form a bubble? It's like, how are you making sure that the people who actually show up at the building have been tested and are free of the disease?
Yeah, so because we knew we couldn't create a bubble, we obviously, of course, want to make the environment as safe as possible, but you can't eliminate risk. And so, a very big focus, I would say, is making sure we didn't create a super spreader event too, for obvious reasons. So we recommended testing for players before they traveled, and that remains our position. Early on, that was because testing was so scarce, and we didn't want players necessarily taking tests from others that might need it, or lying or something like that to get a test just so they can come to our tournament. So we obviously encouraged it, but then on arrival, everyone who receives a credential has to take a PCR test, and not to go into detail, but potentially antibody test depending on their status. And then you kind of heard me say already, they have to wait until that test result comes back before they're kind of allowed to move through the tournament environment. Obviously put in place all of the safety protocols that we've all become accustomed to: mask wearing, social distancing, sanitizing all environments, even down to food. Obviously food's a big part for our players and attendees at our tournaments, and so making sure there's no buffets, and restricting how many people are in each location within the tournament venue at a time. And a lot of work went into making sure that the environment was as safe as it could possibly be.
How many people are on your team working through all of this? This is a lot to take on in one country, let alone to do it all over the world.
Yeah. So, across our organization, it's a huge chunk. I don't know, 50%. For us, I mean, for me on the legal side, I was advising mostly as questions came up, right? Obviously a huge amount of credit has to go to our staff, tournament staff, players that were actually out in the field and putting these protocols that we wrote into place and actually, bringing them to life. And so, we relied heavily on our member relations team, and the local promoters and their relationships with local government and laboratories for testing and all those type of things. Yeah, massive amounts of people, all moving in the same direction to get this off the ground, which was pretty amazing.
I'm sure it was. So then we get into the sort of on the court during the play regulations, which WTA has a heavy hand in, right? Like how many lines people, how many ball people can be, the judges, like the ages of those people. So tell us more about that process, because I know there was a lot of complications there, especially from an age perspective and a safety perspective.
Yeah. So we did have to look at all spaces on the tournament, and one of the big ones is Oncourt. So we did restrict, for example, the number of lines people that are on the court that are making lines calls. So we dropped those down, I think, to only 3 for qualifying, and 5 for main draw matches, which was an adjustment to say the least for everyone. And then you saw, some tournaments, most notably the U.S. Open, which again, it's not our event, but we did actually run one of our WTA events kind of in tandem with the U.S. Open last year. They actually moved to live electronic line calling, where there aren't humans on the court. It's just an electronic system that's making line calls. So it was interesting to see that come into play. But you mentioned age as well. That was a big debate internally, and even with our members, because tennis has a long tradition of having the ball persons, be usually kids. You see kids running around the court grabbing the balls for the players. And early on, a lot of the advice we were receiving from the medical side is that the risks for children were especially high with this disease, And so we made the decision pretty early on that we were not going to allow anyone under 21 to be on the court. And that was a big adjustment, in fairness, because again, these tournaments have been relying on kind of a pipeline of ball person talent that's usually coming from local tennis academies. I know it sounds silly, but it's true. We heard all about that, and we as I guess it shows how we've been adaptable as the medical advice has changed, and as we understand the virus more. And we know now that the risk is a little bit less for children. We've been able to open that up, and that's obviously helped our tournaments quite a bit.
Has there, and I don't know how much of this you're allowed to actually talk about, but in sort of vague terminology, was there a lot of pushback from players? I mean, when you talk about fewer lines people, that might mean there's less accurate calls happening. Like how much of the back and forth there was contentious?
Yeah, so look, I think the vast majority of our players got it, right? I mean, we're in a global pandemic, and I don't know. Vast majority is probably even not a strong enough term. Pretty much everyone understood where the world was, where we were as an organization, and we went to great efforts to make sure that we were communicating with both our player and tournament members. We started holding weekly and even bi-weekly at our I think it's twice a week, whichever one it is, with all players. Any player could join the call with our CEO, and a lot of our executives going through issues, allowing them to ask questions. And so I think the transparency really helped the process. Helped build trust, because obviously we were trying to do the best we could for all of our members. And so again, as I said before, players get a ton of credit for having to go through what is already a pretty grueling lifestyle, traveling all over the world, being away from family and friends for long periods of time, and then having quarantine, having to bring fewer people with you than you're used to. As you said, having kind of some different competition things that you're not used to, and making adjustments to all that. So I guess that's a long way of saying that not a lot of pushback. Players were great.
That's good. That's good to hear. I mean, it's everybody is in this together, and the WTA and all the players and the sport itself is good when everybody's aligned.
Yep.
I know you mentioned a couple times now, I don't know, we talked about this beforehand, that your manual was a living document, and it was built with flexibility so that as guidelines changed and recommendations from the medical community changed, you all were able to adapt on the fly, which is harder than it sounds, I'm sure. A lot of this sort of culminated with the Australian Open, right? I know, again, you guys don't own that event, but you were there as an organization, and it was a very different experience, right? Talk a little bit about how Australia was different, like what that felt like, what it was like for everybody.
Yeah, so I didn't go, so I can't give a first person account, but probably most people who are listening know that Australia was in a very different place than a lot of the world for several months, even before the Australian Open happened at the beginning of the year. So I think by the time everyone had arrived, they had basically zero community spread, and no cases for something like 60 days. And so it was unique in that we were basically able to hold tournaments as if it was pre-pandemic. The cost of that was quarantine. So they put, understandably, the Australian government put in heavy quarantine restrictions, and a lot of conversations. As you said, Tennis Australia was leading this. It's their tournament, but we did run some WTA tournaments in conjunction with them leading up to that, in kind of a blend of our manuals, protocols, and what they had been doing, because again, it was such a different environment. But I've lost my train of thought about the quarantine restrictions. It was originally going to be a little bit looser, in that players could at least get out of their hotel rooms and practice while they were in quarantine. Unfortunately, and I know some of this made into the news, there were some positive cases on some the chartered flights that the Tennis Australia had provided for players and their teams to get to Australia. And so, those restrictions got heavier, and it became complete isolation for 14 days for a good number of our players. So, it was, I think it was probably, um, you know, the best and the worst for the players, and that they had to go through that really difficult quarantine period, and I should say our staff too that traveled over there. But then once they got through it, they could, walk around without a mask. They could go to a movie theater. They could go out to dinner in an enclosed space. All these things that seem like such distant memories for a lot of us. So it was definitely interesting to work through all those issues, but ultimately I think it was pretty successful.
Do you all have events? I mean, just about every week throughout the year, right? Whether they're smaller or larger events. So how does that work for somebody who is required to do a 14-day quarantine? They may have to miss an event or two leading up to that, right?
Yeah. So for 2020, we had basically made the decision that if a country was going to require that restrictive of a quarantine, that we were just not going to be able to operate in that country. Australia was unique because it was the start of our calendar. So we were coming off the off season. Our players and their teams and staff and all that could travel there. They could, and the idea was they could train for a couple weeks and then, start play. So for us to be able to do that in the middle of the calendar is basically impossible. And so again, that's where, working with each local government to make sure they were comfortable with all of the procedures we put in place as far as testing and restricting movement, restricting even what groups on site can interact with each other. So if there is an outbreak, it's kind of contained to one group of people. Working through all those issues, I think really was the reason we were able to operate in some of those jurisdictions.
It's interesting. I'm excited to see, and I'm going to ask you now to predict what's coming next. So we are now, you had Australia, which was January, right?
Yep.
That's the beginning of your year. Now there are millions of vaccines being administered. What's coming? Like, are we getting back to normal for WTA? Just a prediction, what's going to be the rest of 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, so I would love to say that we'd be back to normal in 2021. I think it's going to be really hard to get 100% there, even with, vaccines, starting to be more widespread and immunity starting to build, generally. We are just so geographically diverse that I don't think we're going to be able to look at, any kind of one area and say, we're good now. I think realistically, we will have the procedures in our manual in place for the remainder of the year. But, it is a living document. So, we are kind of like what happened with Australia. If we are going to an environment and we will be there long enough that it kind of makes some sense, then maybe we can, lessen some of these restrictions. But for the tour, I think realistically, it's probably going to be fairly similar for the rest of the year. But, other things might change, right? So for the most part, we haven't had fans at all. Australia was different. They were able to have fans for a time. And then, there was another case and that was all in the news too. So you probably saw that fans, couldn't come for a time, but we may be in a situation where we're at least allowing our tournaments to be able to bring fans into the stands, which is a huge step for sure. So even if we can make small, small steps, small progress, things like that, I'll take it. It's moving towards normalcy.
I don't know. I mean, as you've talked about, and as people know, I mean, tennis is about the most global sport you can have when you're sourcing players from all over the world and you're playing tournaments all over the world. It's incredible what you all were able to accomplish in managing this. So hats off to you and your team. That is a wrap for us today, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for tapping me to
Happy to do it. And thank you for sharing all this wisdom. I think, like I said, it's very impressive stuff that you guys did. So appreciate everybody joining us today. We will be back live again in 2 weeks. Hope you all have a good night.
Thanks everybody for joining.